Hello, everyone. This is Ted Bauman here, editor of the Bauman Letter and of Bauman Daily. I have a long-standing interest in public policy around market structure and competition, sometimes I like to talk about these things. And today, I want to present what I believe is probably one of the most important arguments anybody could hear in the context of current public policy debates, particularly around the bill that the Democrats are trying to pass, the so-called Build Back Better bill. It contains many things that I think are deserving of government support, but it also contains things that I think are really trying to address real problems in the wrong way. And in a way, hearkening back to my older series that I called Bauman Unhinged, here is a new updated installment on the issue of market structure and why the kinds of policies that folks like Bernie Sanders and AOC and some of the others are actually trying to address real problems in a wrong way. So let's start with some raw facts. Soaring costs, particularly for things like hospitals, medical care, college, and so on, have blown a hole in the budgets of the working and middle classes in the United States, which has really meant that all the benefits of a growing economy have not accrued to them. Here's a chart that shows the cost of various items going back to 1998. Now, some things like food and beverages and housing have risen at, they've risen at a fairly moderate rate. But others like medical care, tuition, college tuition, child care, and hospital and other related services have just gone completely haywire. So while we're actually paying less for things like toys and maybe apparel and a few other things than we used to in the old days, we're paying far, far more for other things, and that is causing this, which is a chart that shows that right now, well, actually, as of 2018, the median male income for a family of four, so in other words, if the male works in a family of four right now, in 2018, you can no longer afford what is considered to be the basic lifestyle of an American household, including housing, healthcare, a vehicle, and some college payments for their kids. And the biggest ones down there are housing and healthcare. Now, the problem is that these cost pressures have put a lot of they've created growing public demand that we shift those rising costs onto public budgets. In other words, if you say that the cost of healthcare is rising, then you say, well, then government should take on more about that. What that means is that when people like Bernie Sanders or AOC or those others talk about quote unquote socialism, what they're really talking about is subsidizing these increasing expenditures. That's not socialism at all. Socialism is traditionally understood as the government taking over entire industries and running them for public benefit rather than for private benefit. In this case, what the progressive left and Democratic Party is actually calling for is more like Scandinavian social democracy. But there's a big difference and a reason why that kind of social democracy won't work here right now. And that's because the United States is effectively a crony capitalist economic system when it comes to these critical sectors. The problem is that unlike the Scandinavians, who have addressed that crony capitalist issue in their housing and education and healthcare systems, if we were to try to move to subsidizing these costs by moving them onto the public budget, it will just create an upward spiral because it will mean that the suppliers of these services can just keep raising their costs until the taxpayer finally revolts and the whole system collapses. So let's look at a couple of different sectors in the US economy and see what actually drives the costs and how a focus on cost as opposed, or rather price and payment as opposed to cost actually conceals more than it reveals. Now, U.S. healthcare expenditure is about 18% of GDP, which is double that of our peer countries in the OECD. Now, what most people don't understand, and you see it all the time when people talk about government keeping your hands off healthcare and all that kind of stuff, is that the government already subsidizes practically the entire offerings of the entire U.S. healthcare system in one way or another, including private insurance. So here is a pie chart I put together that shows the percentage of healthcare expenditures by payer. The biggest one is private insurance, but that is tax subsidized. I'll show you a chart in a minute. The second biggest one is Medicare. The third biggest one is Medicaid and CHIP, which is for kids, and then the VA and Indian Health Services and other, basically socialism for the military, as they call it, and then out of pocket at 11%. Now, here's a chart that shows the average tax subsidy for employer-provided health insurance according to the various deciles of income. Now, the point is here that when a person gets health insurance from their employer, they're getting it because it's not taxed. It is part of the employee's compensation package, but it's not subject to tax. So implicitly, there is a government subsidy involved here. Although it doesn't involve direct expenditure by the government, it does affect the fiscus, and therefore it should be considered what's known as a tax expenditure. So if you look at the growth rate at the higher end of the income scale, that subsidy has actually declined somewhat, or did decline between 2004 and 2012. But once you get into the lower parts of the income strata, it's actually increased dramatically. So the amount of money that we are all subsidizing through foregone taxes is actually increasing for a big chunk of the American working class. Now, my point here is that by focusing on who pays for healthcare, we're ignoring the question of who charges for healthcare, because that's where the big cost drivers are coming from. Now, let's take Medicare as an example. It's about 14% of federal spending. It's projected to grow from 3.7% of GDP to around 6% by 2040. People say that it is going to end up bankrupting us. But the problem is that it's the expenditure. The expenditure side is not the issue. It's the charging. It's not what we're spending. It's what's being charged. And there's actually a mythology out there that Medicare is more expensive than private insurance. In fact, medical spending for privately insured people is rising at a faster rate than for Medicare patients, which tells us that there's better cost control in Medicare than there is in the private sector. And that raises the question of who charges and who pays, and how does who charges end up driving up costs. Now, let's take dialysis as an example. Excellent one. Medicare spends about 7% of its budget treating kidney diseases, primarily dialysis at around $87,000 per patient per year. Now, that cost is due to two things. One is that two companies, DaVita and Fresenius, have 83% of the market. So they're a duopoly. They effectively don't even have to talk to each other to be able to set prices. And they are almost certainly making monopoly economic profits, which are higher than their cost of production. And we're all paying for it through Medicare. Now, those two companies on top of that are paid per treatment. Now, if you're paid per treatment, then obviously your bread is buttered on the side of trying to prevent people from getting better so you can keep treating them. And that has led to basically the medical industry discouraging people from exploring transplants or home-based dialysis, which is the norm in most of Europe, for example. And again, this comes down to market structure and also the way that the private insurance industry and Medicare pays for this on a per-treatment basis. Now, there are other sources of excessive medical costs. One is what they call state certificate of need laws. A lot of people don't know, but if you wanted to open up a new hospital or a new medical practice or, for example, a new nursing home, many states require that you get government permission to do that. Obviously, the reason why they do that is to protect the existing providers who make nice, hefty campaign contributions to state senators and state representatives and governors when they're campaigning in order to keep this constraint on competition. It's a direct violation of any free market principle, but it is common in the United States. The other one is the federal prohibition on physician-owned hospitals, which I frankly do not understand. The logic behind it is supposed to be that if physicians own hospitals, they have an incentive to inflate prices by, again, doing the charge per procedure. But if you had adequate cost controls, for example, the way the Canadians do it, where they say, look, you have a block grant. If you exceed this, you will not be able to raise prices. Those kind of things happen. So in a sense, what we're doing is we're trying to limit the number of medical providers in order to try to limit medical costs, which is exactly the opposite of what you're supposed to do. The other one, which is very interesting, is that nonprofit hospitals obviously cannot distribute their excess income. So they have an incentive to try to take whatever they make above and beyond their cost and invest in high-end services that attract high-end medical clients as a way of absorbing excess capital and increasing their revenues. And that in turn leads to health inflation at the high end, where people basically, went to an Emory University new facility the other day for my carpal tunnel, and I had never seen a building this fancy in my life. They had spared no expense. Everything was expensive. And it's a nonprofit hospital. The fourth issue is the excessive expense of a medical education in the United States. The US and Canada are the only wealthy countries that require doctors to have a 4-year bachelor's degree before med school. In Europe, doctors get a 6-year medical degree, which they start straight away, but therefore they can't practice in the US because they don't have what is considered an acceptable medical education, so they have to retrain, and that means that they are discouraged from practicing here. Well, here is a chart that shows the number of physicians per person relative to health expenditure in the country. And it's clear the United States is a tremendous outlier. We have about the same number of doctors per capita as Mexico, but our health expenditures are just vastly higher. It's 5 or 6 times higher than the same country. So, and that means that it's harder to see a doctor and they're more expensive. Now let's talk about education. Here's a chart that shows public 4-year in-state tuition costs and how they have changed over the last 20 years. Now, the 20-year change is in dark red. The additional in pink is basically the underlying cost, but before government subsidy. At the bottom is net cost, and it shows you, that once you take into account, you look at the cost, tuition and fees, room and board, then you take grant aid and tax benefits, that's what you get down to next cost. But basically what's happened here is that the cost of inflation in the United States has doubled over the last 20 years. In other words, what people actually pay. Now, our primary and secondary education costs, i.e. elementary and high school, are about the same as our peer countries. But the average cost of a U.S. Tertiary education, a college degree, is about double that of our peers. It's about $31,600 per student as opposed to $16,200 per student in Europe. Now, the reasons are not because we're paying our professors and so on too much. Their salaries are about on par with our peers. The problem is, number one, student loans. If they are subsidized, if lenders know that the government is backstopping them, then they make excessive loans that are more expensive than people can afford, and that money then gets paid over to the universities, who then are able to capture about 60% of the student loan's value for their own benefit. In other words, for every dollar that is spent on a student loan, about 60% of it goes into the coffers of the educational institution. Only 40% actually goes to pay for the education of the student. Now, the second thing is that there are far too many higher education institutions in the U.S. relative to potential students, which means that they're all in a in a war basically to try to attract them. And they do that basically, as I'm about to show you, through trying to upgrade their facilities. The other issue is that in the United States, administrative costs are about roughly double what they are, and that is often driven by additional services at universities that are kind of the human form of having a luxurious campus. In other words, you have all these, I won't go as far as saying messieurs, but you get, all kinds of additional services that didn't exist when I went to university, which are now being paid for as a way of attracting students. Now, that raises the issue of the campuses themselves. Over the last few decades, state governments have been cutting the budgets of state universities to such an extent that those universities are forced to attract wealthier families and foreign students who don't require as much subsidy. They need to do that to keep the dollars rolling in, because otherwise, on a per student basis, their subsidies from state governments are declining. To do that, universities have entered into an arms race based on trying to make their campuses more luxurious than everybody else. A friend of mine who was visiting from Washington, D.C., who has 2 about to enter university-aged children, just said he could not believe what he was seeing when he went to some of these campuses. It just makes no sense. Why do we need all these things? Well, the reason is because they're trying to compete for people just like him. They want well-to-do parents who can afford to pay most of the cost of tuition because then they don't need to draw on the state subsidies as much. And that leads to this constant escalation of expenditure by educational institutions in order to try to attract those kind of students, which means that they pay even more. Finally, housing. The key problem in housing in the United States is the refusal to allow increased density in places where land is in short supply. Here is a map of San Francisco. In red, it says that basically means that only single family or duplexes are allowed. Orange means that you can have triplexes or fourplexes, but green is the only place where you can have apartment buildings. Now, in a situation like that, obviously rents are through the roof. They've fallen a bit this year thanks to COVID, but right now, the only way that, for example, the San Francisco municipal government or even some other politicians can think to address this is by subsidizing rents. But if you do that, you're just subsidizing the landlords, right? Because it means that you're saying, well, we're not changing the underlying structure of the housing market, but we're going to pay part of people's rent, and then all that goes into the pockets of the landlords, who therefore have no incentive to increase the housing supply. Now, the takeaway from all of this, what I'm trying to get at today is that, I am sympathetic to the need to address these issues, but increasing tax expenditure to do it without addressing these underlying problems is basically not addressing the fundamental problem with the United States economy. And that is that through regulation, through things that the government can control, like the way universities are funded, like land use, like the way hospitals are regulated, like the way that we pay for public Medicare and Medicaid service providers, like the per unit basis, the per service basis, all of that guarantees that if we just start to subsidize this stuff, we'll end up with higher and higher prices, and eventually the system will collapse. If we want to do these things with respect to Senator Sanders and others, the thing to do is to address the competitive nature and the regulatory nature of these essential parts of our economic system, and then see where it's appropriate to subsidize. Just shoveling out tax money into the gaping maw of America's crony capitalist, semi-monopolist industries, particularly in these sectors, is not a way to do it. Well, that's it from me this week. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say, so make sure you put your comments down below. Obviously, I'm looking for reasoned discussion rather than just political talking points, but let's have at it, and I will try to answer some of your questions in my replies below. Anyway, take care. I'll talk to you next week.